Recording. So yeah, all right. So what can I do with this to make it smaller? Yeah, just do that. We don't need to look at everybody's face. And yeah, actually my face is gone now too. So that's good. You don't I don't need to stand close to the video then. All right, so I'm just going to move this down. Got our recording started. Cascading style sheets. We're going to use the grid to actually look at how we can style a page to organize the different elements that we put into some other element onto where we want to put them in the page. Now, we used float last time, so this is going to try to achieve the same things that we did with float, but this time we're going to do it with a different way using grid. So these are the things that we'll do. We'll look at grid styles, we'll define a grid layout, place items within a grid, and manage the space. Now, you do have an exercise to do. There's a couple of videos at the end of this that you can watch. Right, so the idea of a grid-based layout is that you can divide your screen, or let's say the body of a page, or some other element into a grid type organization with rows and columns. And the rows and columns can be represented by this. Now, do you notice that there's actually some space between the rows and the columns? So we can organize that as well. But we also can organize the number of rows, the number of columns, the number of rows we could organize but most often what we try to do is let the number of rows be determined by how many elements that we're going to fill in there. So usually we just set the number of columns. Sometimes we do the number of rows as well. The number 12 here is mentioned because 12 is easy to divide into smaller numbers that will still work across the page. Like, you know, what would you do with 15? You can just divide it by 3 or 5. And so that's the only thing you could use. But with 12, you could divide it by 2, so you could have 6, or you could divide it by 3 so that you could have 4. And so there's a number of different options that you can do in subdividing your grid if you set it up with a number 12. So for example, this page is set up with a grid with 12 columns. So our 12 columns could then be subdivided into something that could be useful to us. So for example, we could have a heading across the top here. Maybe we could have a nav bar down the side. And in the middle, we might use all of that as one space, sort of as represented by it all having the same color. Or we could divide it up, as you see, into 6 other little components, or into, in this case, 8 other components, or into 4. Yeah, so we've got a lot of flexibility with the number 12 there. And this is just to show you typically what we might do with a grid layout, where we had set it up initially with 12 columns, and then something over there on the right, which might be just a sort of a place for an article or something, because we'd put the nav bar probably down the left side. This should not be new to you, this idea of flexible or fixed grids. So it's similar to the flexible and fixed widths and size that you used when we were in an earlier exercise. So we can use pixels, etc., or millimeters for our widths if we wanted to do something like that and have a fixed grid. But more likely, you might have a web page that you might want to be accessible to people using different platforms. You know, they might be using a large screen like I've got here on this Mac that we're looking at here in the classroom, or they might be using a mobile phone or a tablet or something. And so that on a much smaller screen, you organize that differently, and you could use some kind of responsive design, which, as you know, is not exactly fluid. It's fluid with some kind of restraints on it. And we can do that with grids as well. So basically the stuff that we did with floats in a previous lesson, we can do it with grids. Now, if you're going to do grids, then you need to actually have in your CSS for the element that's going to hold the grid. So the grid will take up the element. So as it says there, where it's referred to here as the container, for that container, you want to style it in the CSS and give it the command that it's going to display the grid. So as it says there, the items in the grid are only the direct children of the container in which the grid is found. Thus, container siblings are not part of the grid. So is there anything else inside the grid? Inside the container in which the grid is styled. So for example, you might have a body, and then in that body, you put your grid. Okay, anything else that's in there won't be part of the grid unless it's like a child of it. Now, remember the block level as opposed to the inline level. So the grid's going to be block level, but the elements that are inside it won't be. They will be considered not block elements, and so they can't be floated. So that's something to sort of keep in your mind. Once you've done the grid, you won't be floating the elements that are inside of it. Okay, so how do we create our grid? So once we've done the display and made it a grid, we can, on the element that we want our grid to work, we can define it with the grid template columns. And this is the command that we're using there. We're saying, in this case, we've got 3 columns. So the first column has been set to 150 pixels, the second column to 300 pixels, and then we've got another column out there which we've said will be automatic. In other words, it kind of take up whatever's left over. So that's one way of doing it. And the other measures that you've used before for size, we can use those as well. So you can see there, we could use pix, we could use %, EM. We wouldn't have to set up a column with pixels. We could use it with others. Yes?
So I can add as many columns I want.
You can put columns across there, well, within the limits of what can be displayed on the screen, right?
So for example, if I want to add 5, so I just need to add 2 numbers?
If you want to do 5, you can do it with a repeat, actually. I think that's shown later in the slides here. You could do a repeat 5 times and then say what you're going to repeat it with. Or you could just put out the 5 different sizes. Yeah, but if you wanted them all to be the same, you could just do a repeat 5 times. I think that's shown in a slide here later on. Well, so we have this concept of a fractional unit. What the fractional unit is able to do is that you can have all of the columns, for example, you'd use fractional units for columns, to be proportional multiples of each other. So in this case, we've got 2 columns, and the first column is twice as wide as the second column. Does that make sense? So that's why the first column is 2 fractional units, and the second column is 1 fractional unit. And in the bottom case, what we've got is we've got 3 columns. Now the first column is set to a fixed width of 150 pix, and then the other 2 columns, the second column is twice as wide as the third column. Does that make sense? So that's using fractional units to set up our columns. That's a very nice way of doing it. I think you might find that useful in the exercise today that I'm asking you to do. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this because you do have an exercise to do. Now, grid template row, doesn't that look familiar? We just talked about grid template columns. You can put a grid, you can specify the number of rows if you want. And when you do that, you don't have to, because once it runs out of space in the column, it's going to go down to the next row. But you can actually specify the number of columns as well, rows as well, in which case where they meet, that's going to be called a grid track. We've got a way of identifying those, and you'll see that in a later slide. Now, but let's look at this here. I mentioned a minute ago the repeat. So what this is saying is make the first column 150 pix, then repeat this pattern twice. This pattern is 2 units and fractional units and 1 fractional unit. So you're going to have the third column is going to be twice as wide as the fourth column, but then that's going to be repeated so that the 5th column is going to be twice as wide as the 6th column. So it's actually going to be 6 columns, right? One column there. Is that right? That's 5 columns. So let me go back and do the numbers right. One column there, that's the first column. The second column will be twice as wide as the third column. And then the fourth column will be twice as wide as the fifth column, because that'll repeat. And if we put this number here to 3, then we'd get, instead of 5 columns, we'd have 7 columns, right? If this was 4, we'd have 9 columns, etc. So we could do that repeat. I think that would be what you were talking about. Maybe you wanted to do. That could give you, I mean, if you wanted, you could just put repeat 5 times one fractional unit, and you get 5 columns, all the same size. Or if you want 20, you could do 20 times, right? Yeah. So that would be a quicker and easier way to do it, I think, to get the thing that you wanted to do with it, you were talking about. Now, the idea of the grid lines is if you set up your columns and your rows, you can move a particular sort of element that you have, you know, maybe you have your elements placed in the grid, and maybe one goes to a place that you didn't want it to, if you just let it go by itself. Well, you can actually specify specifically where you want a particular item to go, so it won't go to the default point. And so these numbers help you to do that. And how these numbers work is we say the element is between. So if we had something that we wanted to put here, we'd say it was in between column 1 and column 2. And it would also be in between row 1, because this is row 1. So I mean, it's kind of weird because in computing, we usually start counting from 0. So this is different. We're actually starting counting from 1. So there's our row 1, and there's our row 2. Here's our column 1, and here's our column 2. So if we wanted to put an element, well, let's say we wanted to put something here, we would say, okay, in the row starting at 2 and ending at 3. So in between row 2 and 3, and in between column 3 and 4, that would be this thing here. But you can actually use this to put something in more than one column or more than one row. So you can actually say, okay, I want it to actually go between, to start, I want this image or whatever it is to start in position, or sorry, in row 2, but go to row 4, and from column 2 to column 5. So it could take up all of this space here. You can do that. And actually, we've got an example of that. Now, at the bottom there, we've got things with negative numbers. Supposing you're like you are suggesting, you want to have lots of columns and lots of rows. Well, those numbers can start getting confusing. So what we can do is we can say, okay, when you get to the right hand, to the far end, and the far bottom, we can just start using negative numbers, where -1 means the last one. All right, you get me? So instead of having to remember how many, count them all across, you can just say, all right, well, I just want to put it in the bottom corner. So that would be the row between the last row -1 row, and the second to last row -2 row, and the last column -1 column, and the second to last column -2 columns. So we could say that's that position there. In other words, just the bottom corner. So we don't have to count them all across. That saves us if we got lots and lots of rows and columns. Otherwise, you might not use it too much. This is what I was talking about there. You might want to have a element that takes up more than one row and more than one column, and you can do that. So how we've done that here, we've got article here. It's row and column. So it starts, and we're using the slash to indicate that, right? So it starts in row 1 and ends in row 3. Starts in row, there's row 1, and ends in row 3. It starts in column 2 and ends in column 4. And so that thing can take up all of that space. So that's kind of nice to help you sort of setting things up. This is just another way of doing the thing that we just talked about just 2 seconds ago. So what you might say is, okay, I want it to start in row 1 and go for 2 more rows. That's what the span means. So go to 2 rows. So it's going to go from row 1 to row 3. But the way we say that is 1/span 2. And it's going to start in column 2, and it's going to go for 3 columns. So another way of saying that would be from column 2 to column 5. But we just say column 2 span 3. Whichever way you think is easier for you. Sorry, I'm just trying to show you that going back. That's why. Where was it? It was here, right? Yeah, so that's one way of doing it. It was just with the slash from row 1 to row 3 and from column 2 to column 4. That's one way of doing it. That's shorter, right? But you could do it with the span if you want to be more specific about how many columns and rows you're using. So 2 ways of doing the same thing. All right, so what if you've got lots of rows and columns again, and you don't want to get confused, and so you want to set up different particular areas to do different things on your page. So on your page, you might have a page like this with header, sides, mains, and nav. Now, how that's going to actually work, how it's going to work is you're going to have a column here, a column here. Well, I suppose that could just be one column, right? You're going to need at least 3 columns, right? You're going to need a column for this side, a column for that side, and a column for the middle. And so what you'll do is you'll say, oh, the header takes up all 3 columns. The side just takes up the left column. The middle takes up, the main takes up the middle column. Left column, middle column, and the nav takes up the right column. And the footer takes up all 3 columns. So how we could do that is we could define it. And so this is not showing the HTML, it's just showing the CSS, right? But what this is showing is that when in your HTML, you've got an ID for the header. And so, you know, that in your HTML, your header is going to have the ID of header. And it's going to be in a div with an ID of header. And so what you're going to do is you're going to assign that. Here we're assigning it. We're using this command, grid area. We're going to assign that to header. And so that when we use you'll see another command that we'll use that will refer to header in a second. And likewise, we're going to have in our HTML an ID in a div which refers to the main, and all the stuff that we have in the main is going to be in it. And then we're going to assign it using CSS. We're going to assign it with this name main. Okay, now why is that important? The next slide. Oh no, not the next slide. Where did that go? Yes, you're right. There was a slide before. Yes, thank you. And so what you will do is in the CSS, in the element where that is, you will state that you've got your 3 columns. And here we're saying you've got 3 columns. The middle one is 3 times as wide as the others, right? The other 2 are skinnier. The middle one is 3 times as wide. And we're going to set them up, and we're going to do header, 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 right? So it takes up all 3 columns. The first column, second column, third column, right? And again, so for each of these, you can map them like that, right? First column, second column, third column. And then the bottom is going to be the same. So, but in order to do that, you have to do the thing that we did below. Sorry, I missed the sequence on that a second ago. You can have spaces between the grid, and you'll do that with this command, grid gap. And here we've got first for the row and then for the column. And that's shown here as a gap there, which might be nice. I mean, you can do that with other things as well. You can use your padding or whatever. Yeah, that's, or you can do it. So this one, grid gap with the row and the column, or you can do them separately. Grid gap row, grid gap column, and just give yourself that space. Okay. What was I thinking about that? I was thinking about the. Do look at the video that's why I asked you to put in the. I give you a box for your drop down box, right? So you've got a box for that. Look at the second video. The first video is like 59 minutes. So look at that at your leisure. Maybe don't look at that now. I'm trying to sort of make this shorter now. But you know, if he goes through it very slowly and basically going through these slides, it takes 59 minutes. So anything that you think that I didn't spend enough time on, you can have a look at that. But do look at the second video. That takes our chocolate, our chocolate place web page, and it applies grids to it There's some things that you really want to look closely at there, at like the padding and using width 100%. Some of these things that we kind of learned last time, you're going to kind of need to do. Now that we just got some stuff there about aligning things vertically and horizontally. This is specific to the grid, right? So you might have a column which is got your nav in it, and you will want to align all the things in that nav the same vertically, and so you'd use it for that. So this isn't like the align that you've been doing with your text line. And the justify is similar. If you want to align things out horizontally, you can use that for that. We've got stretch, start, end, and center as well. I'm hoping that, yeah. All right, so yeah, the one thing, so if you don't have a bunch, a column with multiple elements in it, you've got a single element, you can just align it with that align self. For example, if you had an article and you just wanted it to be aligned center inside the element in which it is in the grid. I think that's about it. There are 2 videos to look at. As I said, the second video, I'll just start it for you so you get an idea. Because when you see it, you'll say, oh, I know that. Does that look familiar? Some reason the video is not coming through. Maybe that was, so have a look at that. He goes through step by step, showing you the code. So it's not like you have to invent this code. You just have to basically follow the steps. And, you know, at this point, I think that's fair. You know, you follow the steps, you'll be able to do this. You just need to take the time to do it. Okay? So that's what I want you to do, is go ahead and get that video going. And he's very, you know, you might have to sort of go over things a little bit more than once, but as I said, if you look at it carefully, you're going to see the code. The code is the starter pack, I think, is pretty much the same starter files that you had last time. So doesn't it look familiar? It's pretty much the same starters. So you're just treating them a little differently. Okay. So have I got any questions? Now, what I should do is I should see who's here. Okay, so Charles is online as well. I can't remember. This is the problem. Now I'm on a Windows device, not a Windows device. Now I'm on a Mac device. It's a little bit harder to do the sprint, the print screen. So
Command Shift and 4.
Command Shift
And 4, and highlight the window you want to.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, okay. And then you have to save it, right? Command Shift 4 or F4?
Command Shift 4, number 4.
All right, let's try.
Yeah, you just move the mouse to the window and like go.
Yeah, I got it. And then I'm going to save that. So thanks so much.
It's automatically saving the desktop.
All right, so I got it. All right, so we know who's here. All right, so there are any questions? Thanks for that. I can see the Apple user here. This is the first time I used the Apple in a few months. So I couldn't remember that. Any other questions that we might have? Let's see, got something in the chat. Sir, if you could make the right and wrong answers of, oh yes, I got that question before. Other sections have got this feature. Could favors us. I will see if I can find out about it. I didn't know that other students had that feature. So since that's the case, I suppose I will have to, Ashla. All right. Any other questions? The right and wrong. I didn't want to give it before because I wasn't sure if all the other sections had actually done the quiz yet. So it wouldn't be kind of cool with you guys sitting out there with all the right and wrong answers, right? And then you're sitting beside your friend who's doing the quiz. Can you see why I'd have a problem with that? Anyway, so I didn't want to, but I will talk to the other teachers and I'll find out if that's the case. So, I mean, you can see that video is going on in the background while we're doing this, and see he's going ahead, he's giving you all how to do it, and with a nice instruction that goes with it. Any other questions? Because I'll get you started on that, because it is a bit of work to get that to work. So I will leave you with that. All right. Thanks then. and I will end the meeting. Cheers, guys.
When is it due?
I think I gave you a couple of days. Like
2 days.
2 days, something like that. 2 days. You'll
Okay,
see
sure.
on the Dropbox, it's got a date. I think it's like 2 days from now. Got 2 more messages on there. In the, thank you. Okay, that's good. All right. See you later then. Cheers. You didn't upload the lab in D2L. No, there's no lab yet. Good point. I did not load the lab. There's no lab yet. The lab will come later. This is not a lab. This is an exercise. Okay. So I'm calling it exercise. Okay. So what you have to do for the exercise is you have to follow the video, the last video that's shared with you, and that you have to follow the instructions and do it. Okay. It's a little bit extra work. I'm sorry, but I think it is worth your while to do it. And then we can give you the lab. All right. You'll find the lab will be a bit harder. It'll be especially harder if you don't do the exercise. Okay. Thanks.